Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and as always, thank you for listening.
Oh, we're so glad to be here in the barn on a chilly day.
We have a special announcement. Where's that number? You had it.
Oh, the number.
Yes.
Yes, we have a new hotline, the
hotline.
Jefferson Hour hotline. You can call in your questions or comments. Make them brief. Speak clearly. Call this number, 701-575-0727. 701-575-0727.
I need to write that number down. Tell me again.
This sounds like a infomercial.
Well, that's what I'm trying for.
701-575-0727.
And this is really great because it's going to give listeners a chance to, in their own voice, ask you a question.
So instead of necessarily
Ask
reading
Jefferson
their
a question,
they might get to ask it in their own tones.
Right, and I think there's a couple of caveats. We really don't want questions that are declarations of belief that are 5 minutes long. We love getting those letters, but
which they won't be on the air.
It's really hard to
edit them.
Yeah, well, that or read them in their entirety. So there's a couple other things you can do on here.
You can order copies of programs,
CDs.
You can order. Yeah, that's it, and you can just ask your question. That's the menu.
Yeah, so we're really looking forward to that. I hope we get bombarded with that. And
many questions.
There have been a number of. I have to say, we may want to do a program on this, but we got so much response to a essay that you presented on the Constitutional Crisis show.
And, I was surprised that it was overwhelmingly positive.
It really
some
was.
Negative, but it was
without doing
positive.
anything mathematical, I would guess it was at least 95%.
I was surprised because I kind of grimaced when I did it. I do think we're in this monster constitutional crisis, and it's gotten worse since I left the country, got back. But I think we're going to get through it.
There was a guy who wrote in that he wept when he heard it in his car. He got home and listened to it again in his driveway and wept again.
Wow. Wept for this country, I hope.
Well, I don't know.
Or just wept.
Anyway, we should probably sometime in the future devote a show to that. Also, we had a couple of interested parties. For
the conservative voice.
Right, so we need to talk about that.
So I want to do that. So I want, and others can still apply. We may have several voices, but I'm uncomfortable with the fact that Beau, whom I greatly admire, is clearly an Obamaite. There's no ambiguity about his politics.
Yeah, but he's fair.
I know, but I want intelligent conservative voices too.
He's not one of those rabid, at least. Well, maybe he is. I don't know. He doesn't show it. I think he's pretty fair.
I just think that
he's thoughtful.
We want balance in it, and Jefferson appeals to all sorts of different parts of the political spectrum, and that's important. Jefferson is basically a conservative. That government is best which governs least. That we should be eternally vigilant, that we should watch government like a hawk, that we should be very upset about their spending our money, that we should want as little regulation as is possible, that we should want free and open trade. Jefferson is a libertarian conservative with a radical streak, and it's hard to pin him down. It's hard to know quite where Jefferson is. It depends on the subject, and it sometimes depends on the era of his life. And it's a mistake to make him a liberal Democrat. I do think that in many respects he is a progressive, but there are things of him that are just cranky conservative too. And so I want us not to get locked into a certain ideological view of this man.
Anyway, this week's show is about your return from France. And we have a special guest up here in the middle segment, which I won't tell you who it is. Or do you want to tell them?
No, I think they'll listen to the show.
Yeah.
I want to say this. I didn't say it on the air. There was an incident in France.
Oh, no. Did it involve books going down a sewer? Or?
It was worse almost. So I'm on the canal with a friend of mine. I'll just say that, a woman, a friend of mine who's been on some trips. And we were walking. So we're walking alongside on the towpath. And we were gabbing away, and so we missed a turn. And so we got about as lost as you can get by walking around the block of your house. So how lost can you get? She went into a decline. She felt that she was marooned on the moons of Jupiter. And I didn't have to slap her, get a hold of yourself. And then she says, I needed that. But it was that was the incident, and I just thought I wouldn't say it on the air. But for those in the podcast world, it's not easy being me.
And what is that number for people to call?
Right. To call us with your comments or questions, 701-575-0727. This was a great group of people. When you come back, you want to, on the last couple of days, I just sat on this canal boat, this barge, and I said, I'm trying to drink it in because when I get back, in January, it'll be 20,
you'll go
20
again.
below zero. And
You'll go again.
But you have to try to drink it in so you can kind of remember the kind of sensuous pleasure of being in a foreign country when you have a budget and when you get to go see things and you get to kind of experience the newness of another way of a national enterprise, another national culture. And you want so much to talk to people about what you're seeing and how it's a mirror. It's a mirror you hold up to your life. It's a mirror you hold up to your country. And it's a mirror you hold up to life on Earth. And so, it's amazing how many different softwares there are. They run their world fundamentally different from us.
Well, please listen to this week's show, and you'll get more
some
details
sense of that, yeah.
on all of that. And with that, shall we go to the program?
Let us now go to the special edition, the post-France edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Bonjour.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. This week, we shall be having our conversation with the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and we shall be welcoming him back from his travels in France. And many people probably don't know, of those that are new to the show, but you, sir, you do cultural tours, not only all over America, but in Europe as well. And that is what we are welcoming you back from.
Bonjour, my friend. I am back from France, 2.5 weeks. It was absolutely magnificent. And if you are out there and you have ever been thinking of going on cultural tours, do. We had 18 people. We went to Paris for several days, then to Bordeaux, and on to Nîmes, where the Maison Quarré is, the building that became the model for the Capitol at Richmond. And we went to Arles, which is one of the classical sites that Jefferson found so entertaining and instructive. And then we went for some of us, on the Canal de Midi, which is a 17th century French canal that Jefferson studied for 8 days, which connected the Mediterranean with the Atlantic by way of Marseille and the canal, and then the Garonne River to Bordeaux. It was just like paradise on earth. Jefferson said every man's first country is his own, but every rational person's second country is France. And that's exactly the way I feel. I'm a deep Anglophile. I love Britain. I studied at Oxford. My daughter's now at Oxford. I love England in all of its aspects, but there is something about France. I see what it was that Jefferson found so enchanting about the countryside, the people, the culture, the artistry, the art of living, which, no one ever says that about North Dakota. The art of living.
Well, now, wait a minute.
The art of living?
Well, it's probably no comparison.
Introduce me to some of these enclaves, the salon culture, our beloved state.
Velva.
The home of Eric Severide, but now the home of Dot.
Let's get back on track here.
France.
So, your
France.
cultural tours, what people hear you talking about those often on the show, and this has got to be in your top tier.
I haven't been to France with a cultural tour now for 18 years, and so I was a little sheepish because I don't speak fluent French. It's been a while. I haven't been there recently enough to know the changes that have occurred in what amounts to a Jeffersonian generation. But it turned out to be just absolutely splendid in every way. There's a statue of Jefferson on the Seine River, just across from the Tuileries, the great gardens. And it was there that he looked at the Hotel de Somme, which became the model for the dome at Monticello. And then we went on to Nîmes, where the Maison Quarré is, which is it means the square house, and it's a Roman temple of the 1st century A.D. And Jefferson said it was the most precious morsel of antiquity left in the world, and he insisted that the Capitol in Richmond be based upon it, and it was. Unbelievable journey, 18 people, 2.5 weeks. I'm glad to be back. Of course, everyone's first country must be his own. But I felt present in France, and I tried to look at it not only through Jeffersonian eyes, David, but looking at it as an American who is living in a time of crisis in America. How are things going in France, on the European continent, and how do they see life, and how do they like their cradle-to-grave socialist patterns?
And what do they think of Americans?
Oh my, it's not good.
Well,
they're not happy with us.
Yeah,
we pulled out of the climate treaty. The Trump administration did, the Kyoto Treaty and the Paris Climate Treaty, and the Europeans are mystified by this. Their view is, A, what kind of a nation doesn't get it that we're in a global climate crisis? And B, even if you don't see it that way, a new economy, a greens economy, is profitable. It creates jobs. It's worth doing, even if you discount the peril to the planet. So, and they look on the, as you might expect, on the Trump administration as the end of civilization on Earth as we know it. And so we found ourselves having to say, well, this isn't. There are lots of Americans who think this is good. It shakes things up. It's not the only country in the world where there's a populist reaction to the status quo. You're having one in France. You're seeing one in Britain with Brexit. There's one in Germany. It's not as if we invented this moment in human history. This means something, and it means more than Donald J. Trump.
You're right. It's going on all over. If you were a conspiracy theorist, you would think, well, somebody decided that they'd like to weaken the power of democracy and liberty and freedom all over the world, and they're doing a pretty good job at it. Or is it just the times?
I think we're in a global reaction to globalization. So globalization,
which is something new for human beings.
It is, and it's caused great opportunity in some places, and it's been a rough transition in other places, and it's very rough for the very people that Donald Trump represents. So people who are older, who are not part of the kind of 21st century skill set of web creations and the creative electronic economy. The retraining programs in this country are not good.
People our age.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so there's that. But there's also, I think, a sense that, when the wall came down in 1989, we thought the West won. Liberal democracy was the future for the whole world. That basically the EU and what it represented was solving the problems of Europe. That the liberal world order was like the end point. This was going to be the permanent new software for the world, and other countries that weren't there yet would soon be joining. NATO was expanding, the EU was expanding, other nations wanted in. There was a liberalization movement going on in places like China, even in North Korea to a very limited extent, and in Tehran, in Iran. And then came the Islamic explosion, whatever that represents, 9/11 and what followed. And it has really shocked the world. And what's going on in Syria now has loosed hundreds of thousands, even millions of refugees that are infiltrating Europe. And Europe is trying to figure out how to absorb them. Are they a threat to their national identities? Can their social welfare system absorb these new bodies? Can they train these new immigrants to be competitive in the French, the German, the British, the Scottish economies? Do you lose your national identity when you bring in too many people who don't share your traditional systems?
So did being in France help you answer any of that?
Yes. First of all, it told me that what's going on in this country, however crazy and unsettling it feels on any given day, is something that's going on in the first world, that we're not alone, and every country is wrestling with this. Some, I think, frankly, better than we are, but we are not in any way unique. That's number one. Number two, I think what Europe proves is that you can absorb more than you think, but not as much as is out there. In other words, in the 21st century, the have-nots are drifting into the world of the haves.
I'm always fascinated by Jefferson in France. I think you know that, and I think you are as well.
Completely,
It seems it was some time ago we did a show called Savage in the Wilderness. Do you recall?
About Jefferson's time in France.
Right. Yeah,
I want to do another one.
Phrase,
Savage from the woods of America, right? The wilds of America.
The wilds. And be careful in that word savage, but it was his language.
He meant an American original. I mean, so here's what I've been learning. I've been working on this now in France, and now when I've gotten back, it's impossible for us to exaggerate how primitive America was in the founding era. So when Jefferson goes to France, it's like leaving a frontier of huts and no roads and no water supply and no taverns.
Kind of why people built places like Monticello to sort of wall themselves off.
But it was a tiny little enclave of elegance in a sea of frontier primitiveness. We were a brand new nation. We were still grubbing up trees and plowing lands for the first time. And so when he went to France, suddenly he jumps from a frontier village into the most sophisticated, cosmopolitan, civil, aesthetically advanced nation of history.
Probably at that time in
and
the
an
world,
urban.
Right.
And so he falls in love with it. Like, what's not to love about the ballet and theater and the art of and he says in this really interesting letter, he says, we need to make wine sort of the drink of America, because in France you don't see drunkenness. Now, he wasn't traveling in all circles, but you don't see it. He said, but our meals back in the United States frequently end in violence and brutality because we drink whiskey and and there's a book about this, David, called The Alcoholic Republic, about drinking in the age of Jefferson, and it's true.
Right.
So you have to think, we think of Monticello with its dome and its Palladian elegance. We need to think of Jefferson's world as little different from pioneers living out on the plains of Montana in the 1870s with a tiny little hut and hogs, maybe even in the shack, and just barely getting through their lives with few sets of clothes and sheets that they never get to change and things like that. So that's one contrast that I find. The other contrast, and we should do a program on this, is the radicalization of Jefferson. So I've talked about this a little bit before, but what he basically saw, David, was a failed state. He thought, beautiful countryside, fertile land, thoughtful, amiable people, and they're miserable. 99% of them can barely feed themselves.
It took him a while to come to that conclusion, though, didn't it?
What went wrong with this culture? Number one, what went wrong? What can go wrong? And then number two, we have to do whatever it takes not to let this happen to us in the new republic in America. So he came back with these lessons circulating in his head. You've got to avoid monarchical forms, and you have to avoid maldistribution of wealth, and you have to avoid a national debt, and you can't get locked into a permanent constitution. You have to be a fluid society. He said, I saw what can go wrong. I'm going to come back and be the voice of how to prevent that. And he came back and he wanted to talk that way, and the rest of America was like, "What are you talking about?" Huh? Because things are we don't even have schools.
Well
here,
documented Francophiles, and there were none.
Most Americans then and now are not Francophiles. Jefferson is unique, and I'll tell you this much: we were on the Canal de Midi. There are 3 bronze plaques to Jefferson on that canal. It was so moving to see them because somehow, why Jefferson? He was there for 8 days. He was on a tour. But they understand what he represents as the most Francophilic of all Americans, and certainly the most Francophilic of all presidents of the United States. And they honor this, that he got it.
To this day.
And I was so moved to see these bronze plaques, one of which was in a warehouse, and they actually had to talk it out so we could see it. But I thought, there's nobody else in plaques. Churchill's not on these plaques. Franklin Roosevelt's not on these plaques. Stalin's not on these plaques. It's Thomas Jefferson.
We need to take a short break, and when we return, we have sort of a special
moment.
Yes, so please stay with us until then. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. Back to the matter at hand, and that is your recent travels to France. So you've talked a little bit about the canal and about Jefferson's realizations, about how it changed him, and
welcome to high culture, Mr. Jefferson.
Right. What about Paris? What about
Paris? Oh my! It's I was a little afraid of Paris, but then when you get there, the metro system is just stunningly efficient.
But what about Jefferson in Paris? What's there that you can still see?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, the statue of Jefferson looking at the Hotel de Sable, which became the thing for the dome. So that we also went to the Tuileries Garden, where he spent a good deal of time. We went to the
Is that where he broke his wrist? Or
no. We went to the Champs-Élysées, where his hotel was, his diplomatic residence, right near the Arc de Triomphe, and it's no longer there, but there's a plaque on the wall, and it was there that, cavorting in some way with Mrs. Cosway, he jumped over a stile or a fence and tripped and broke or dislocated his right wrist, and it was never properly fused, and so on and so forth. But we went to several places that relate to Mrs. Cosway. So he met her at something called the Hall au Blé, which was a grain market, a domed grain market that he thought was going to be so groovy. And he went there with John Trumbull, the American painter, and they expected to be like studying the grain market, but instead he meets this drop-dead, alluring woman, Mrs. Cosway, and her husband. And so we went there, and we actually had, while we were there on a Saturday, we had a debate, a head and heart debate. I read the highlights of the head and heart letter that he wrote when she finally went back to England. And then I said, this is like Plato's Symposium on Love. Where are we on this? Whose head, whose heart? And each of the participants then weighed in about whether we should let the heart dictate our choices in life, or whether we should be calculating and let the head make these difficult decisions and not be susceptible to temptations. And it was so interesting. At first, people, were a little uneasy about having a symposium about love, but it took about an hour, and we heard a lot of interesting voices right there at this column, at what's left of the Hall au Blé, which is now an underground cinema and shopping mall. But there we were, and it's one of those situations like on the Lewis and Clark summer trip where you're actually there. You know without a shadow of a doubt that you are exactly where Thomas Jefferson was.
Part of what your cultural tours are famous for.
I love to do that, yeah.
You said you gave me a perfect setup here. You said, hearing from all these different voices. Well, we have a voice. Yes, we have a very special voice, somebody that we're always excited to talk to.
Our friend Dr. Joseph Ellis, who's the author of a number of great books, my favorite of which is Passionate Sage about John Adams, but also American Sphinx, his masterful essay on Thomas Jefferson. Dr. Ellis, you're going to be with us for the whole hour next week, talking about some points you made about the contributions of the Founding Fathers to the permanent system in America. But for the moment, I want to ask you this. We know that Jefferson went to France in 1784, and he came back in November of 1789. He was there to see the beginnings of the second great revolution of his time, a much more serious one, the French Revolution. How do you think Jefferson was a different human being when he got back to this country from that 5-year experience?
It is a formative thing for him. I mean, if I remember when I was writing the book on Jefferson, the Jefferson papers for the early years, it's one volume, goes from like 1758 to 1780, and then all of a sudden they explode, when he's in France, and there's so many more papers. Jefferson in France, because he's writing back to people in Virginia and other parts of America, as well as to French and European friends, all of a sudden becomes multiple. They're different Jeffersons. He's searching for different identities, different voices, and they're talking somewhat contradictorily to people. Like he's writing to people like Lafayette in France about the need to end slavery, and he's writing back to people like Madison in Virginia, saying we can't end it. And you begin for the first time as a biographer to see a man who is he's multiple, and there are different kind of voices, and he's discovering them, and he's testing the values he had acquired as a planter in Virginia in an environment that's perhaps in Paris the most sophisticated intellectual environment in the world.
When he gets back, he's surprised that this country has moved to the right, and there's a sort of counter-revolutionary movement going on. He says this is monarchical and aristocratic and so on. But he's been radicalized by watching a failed state in Europe, and he comes back to see that the country that he thought he left had sort of pulled away from some of the more idealistic notions of the full-on revolutionary period. That put him at odds with some of his countrymen.
Right, with Adams especially, even with Washington, and certainly with Hamilton. You and I might not completely agree on this, because I think he comes back and his version of what he discovers, which is written later and then gets folded into his papers in the early editions into the early 1790s, when it was actually written in 1814, 15, he sort of discovers we're becoming a monarchy. We're moving away from the basic true Whig principles. Well, what's happened? They've just passed the Constitution. We're no longer a confederation of sovereign states. We're a federal republic. We have a presidency. He sees those as movements, as you say, to the right. And Washington and Adams sees it not as a violation or repudiation of the revolution, but an expansion of the revolution.
The saving of it from its worst instincts.
That's correct. That's correct. So his reaction is hyper and in some ways misguided. But one of the interesting things that happens when he comes back, and we should talk about him in France a little bit more, but that Madison goes with him. Madison is one of the most committed nationalists who's behind the whole calling of the Constitutional Convention and the agenda for it. But it's when Jefferson gets back, he jumps over to the Jeffersonian position and goes. That both Jefferson and Madison go to their graves believing that the United States is a plural noun, that it's not a nation, it's still a confederation.
And Hamilton just could shake his head. His feelings were even a little hurt that his pal Madison was seduced bewitched by Jefferson.
How did that happen? That's right. This guy comes back from Monticello who uses his magic wand, and this guy becomes his acolyte. It almost works that way.
But Joe, that tells you something about Jefferson. I've thought about this through the entire time I was in France. So he comes back, and Madison has really gone. He and Hamilton are partners. That they share a worldview. They played a key role in the Federalist Papers and the ratification process, and suddenly Madison flips and becomes a super Jeffersonian. He's a little more sober than Jefferson, but he's in Jefferson's camp. So that tells you something. That tells you either that Madison was an impressionable and susceptible person, which I don't think is true, or that Jefferson had some sort of extraordinary magical charisma, some sort of power over the people who got close to him, that they surrendered to him in some important ways. I
think either you surrender or you hate him. And Hamilton did the latter, and Madison did the former. But there's no question there is charisma. There's one way to talk about it, but I think it's more seductive charisma is not the right term. It's elan. There's some sort of a gentle, magnificent appeal in his elegance, his high-mindedness, his aesthetic. He doesn't overwhelm you. He lures you. And,
with fine wine.
That's right, and with fine conversation, and with the right accent.
But you know better than any human being alive that there was one person on earth who loved Jefferson to the very bottom of his toes, but who could resist him, and that was your man Adams.
I know. And they did, and the fact that they did love each other is reflected in the fact that they, as Adams said, you and I ought not to die until we have explained ourselves to each other in that correspondence. And,
but Adams did the heavy lifting in that correspondence.
He did, 2-to-1 in terms of letters.
But not just that, but Jefferson's kind of gliding around and talking about his gardens and the weather and books he's reading.
He's founding the University of Virginia. He's got other things going on.
Adams wants to get on the ground and wrestle.
Absolutely, and I'll show you, and there's one of the things, to get it back to France, that Jefferson admits in that correspondence is to Adams. He says to Adams, "You were right, and I was wrong about the French Revolution."
It's the only time he ever admitted a mistake.
I didn't know that, but I think that's probably the only time I can remember, is certainly on a major matter of that sort.
And you broke the news to the historical world that Jefferson late in his life went back in and touched up his correspondence to cover his naivete about the French Revolution.
Yeah, the early letters, that's right. He made it sound like he was suspicious that it wasn't going to work out, which of course he wasn't. And
but that was an Ellis discovery, and some people were pretty upset by that, but it seems to be true.
Nobody ever complained to me about that, but I guess they didn't talk to me.
They never talked to you again after that. So France, he falls in love maybe with Maria Cosway. As you now know, that's where probably the Sally Hemings saga with Jefferson gets its start. He stares like a lover at his mistress at the Maison Quarrée, which becomes the model for the Capitol at Richmond. This is a very fruitful time in his life.
Tell me when you went back to that part of France to tour, to guide a tour for people, you got a chance to visit and to rethink, in a palpable way. Did it affect the way you think about Jefferson and France at all, or did it just amplify perspectives you already had?
No, it actually did change the way I saw things. I've only been to France a few times previously, and this was a very targeted exploration of Jefferson's footprint in France. And so a couple of things. First of all, you see the Hotel de Somme, and you realize, oh, we have a dome at Monticello for one reason only, that Jefferson was in France. If he hadn't gone to France, chances are he would not have put a dome on that building, making it almost the most iconic Palladian structure in the New World. So there's that. Then you see that Jefferson is looking at these wineries and traveling around the countryside, and he has that famous letter to Lafayette. You remember where he says you got to go into their hovels and you got to ask for some food,
Right.
and maybe lie on their bed saying you need a nap, and then he said maybe you can come back and fix their lives a little and put 2 morsels of meat in the pot. And so he's taking this very, very seriously. And so when I did this, I thought, first of all, he was right. France is a marvelous country, and the rap that France gets, that it's kind of rude to Americans and haughty about its own culture, that's not really true, Joe. They are he was right that France is an incredibly civil and civilized place, and if you don't come off as an ugly American, they embrace the people who come to visit. So I got that, but what I was trying to figure out, and it's off our subject, is how come they're so happy? They're a socialist system with cradle-to-grave health care and cradle-to-grave education and old age pensions. Their unemployment insurance is some of the best in the world. They're taxed at about 52% of their gross income, and they're happy. And here we are in our great nation of liberty and freedom, where we're a grumpy, disgruntled people, and we have to claw to buy tennis shoes for our children. It seems like we need to look at some of these other models of life in the 21st century and be less provincial about our joy in our own.
Don't tell me you think that Jefferson might turn out to be a socialist.
Well, he was a kind of quasi-socialist. You remember that letter where he says we got to redistribute income downward at a certain point? And
He does. I've forgotten that, and this is going to come up in the debates that are going to be happening in the presidential campaign. You know that.
He said something that Franklin also agreed with, which is that property is a socially derived right, that you have an absolute right to a modicum of property, but that's Lockean, but you only have a socially privileged right to masses of property, and that if the culture can't feed itself, that the government has a right, the social contract has a right to come to you and say,
well, there's
look,
a
Joe,
big change, and it's not life, liberty, and property.
No,
it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He takes property out of the founding statement, the most important words in American history. He changes that.
Our mission statement removes property.
That's right. That's right.
He is a quasi-semi-socialist in certain moods.
It's also the one anti-slavery sentiment in the document that a lot of people didn't see then, but that because later on slave owners are going to claim they have the right to property is the right to their slaves that can't be denied them. That's going to be the position in Dred Scott, and Jefferson is opposed to that.
And so I think you say in your books that the preamble, which we regard as sacred writ, was really just boilerplate for the founding fathers. Like, well, I'll get to the indictment of George III.
That's right. They spent a day and a half editing the document. They didn't change a word in that. They changed about 800 words in the rest of the document, but that they thought it was just a kind of
just intro.
Overture.
Yeah, preface,
intro, and it's funny because it's the most important words in the document.
Blah, 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 liberty. Now let's say that he's quartering troops in our houses, that he's taking us across the ocean for trials.
It's like it's there in plain sight. It takes Lincoln to really see it clearly.
Absolutely. Lincoln saved Jefferson by saying if that sentence meant anything, it means everything. That if we mean that all men are created equal, we're going to have to actually step up here, folks.
That's right. That's right. If you go back to Jefferson, even when he disappoints you, and he's going to do that, and anybody that doesn't disappoint you isn't worth studying because they're perfect, and therefore, what do we have to learn from them? They're gods. And in this particular instance, I think there's something in the French mentality that is buoyant, and that joie de vivre, pursuit of happiness, that he has, that France, the wine, the winery around,
The art, the dance, the
yeah,
ballet,
yeah,
the
yeah,
gardens, the
yeah,
architecture,
yeah,
the
yeah.
conversations, the salons.
And I really think that Jefferson, I hope, will be able to speak to us as a people soon again.
And that's the thing. See, now because of where we are, we're fixated on Jefferson and slavery, Jefferson and race, Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And we should be, because it's a corrective to decades of ignoring
Right.
and papering this over. But it gets in the way of that Jefferson that you're talking about, the Renaissance man, the man of taste, the man who knew ancient Greek, the man who could build a Palladian structure, the man who
That's right.
understood something about the taste and sensibility and identity of the American people. And I think if we let go of that, if we forget that because in the name of social and racial justice, that's as big a mistake as trying to ignore slavery.
I think you and I are in exactly the same place in that, and people that are discovering Jefferson for the first time and need to repudiate him need to do that. But later on, as they get older, they will come to view him, I hope, as they come to view their parents, as people that they still have something to learn from.
As you said earlier, you surrender to him or you hate him.
That's right.
Joseph Ellis, we have had such fun talking with you today. This is great. I can't wait for our next conversation. My dream now is to get you on the Canal de Midi in southern France, and you and I will drink a little fine Bordeaux there. And,
you pay the trip and I'll come.
All right, but you have to tell the lockkeepers that we can improve their design with certain adjustments. We'll talk to you soon, my friend.
It's truly a wonderful opportunity for us to get together and talk like this.
Let's keep doing
it. I stopped teaching 5 years ago, and I probably need to have conversations like this on a regular basis to get my thoughts into the conversation.
Well, let's try to talk every month or 6 weeks, and we'll keep moving.
I'm at you guys' disposal. I'm here, and I really, Clay, it's really great. And
I love knowing you, and I feel like these are very rich conversations, and our listeners just light up when you come on. So go get your dogs back in, and we'll talk to you shortly.
Take care, my man. Bye-bye.
I so enjoy listening to the two of you exchange ideas on Jefferson.
Every time I pick up his books, I just think, thank goodness such a historian exists, because he's not like a straight academic where he writes prose that nobody wants to read.
He's great fun to read. He's great fun.
He has a beautiful prose style, very accessible, and he has a sense of humor, which you hear, of course, in the exchange between us. But he has a unique historical irreverence and sense of humor. I think he said he's an ironist. Irony is his way, his lens on the world.
Somewhere he said that, yeah.
If I could be Joseph Ellis, I would.
We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We're talking about France, and we've had the delightful experience of bringing Joseph Ellis on to talk about what Jefferson learned in France and how it changed his perspective when he returned to the United States.
I hope that our listeners enjoy these conversations between you and Joseph Ellis as much as I do. I suspect they do. Before we go on, I want to mention one more time the books of his two that you highly recommend. The first would be American Sphinx, about Thomas Jefferson, and the second would be Passionate Sage, about John Adams. Both really fun reads, and we'll put links up at the website, jeffersonhour.com. You can find out a whole lot more about the show, and you can support the show there. Before we go on, anything more you'd like to say about the tours to France?
Only this much. These cultural tours are thrilling to me. I so appreciate the people that come on them. Thanks to all of you. I know they're Thomas Jefferson Hour listeners, and a couple of them are actually coming to Cuba in February, and a couple of them are coming on the Lewis and Clark Trail come late June and July. So that's exciting to me. And the fact that people come back, repeat customers on these cultural tours is one of the happiest satisfactions of my life. So it was really moving to me, this whole experience. And I thought, I'm going to go to France as often as I can for the rest of my life. I feel so shabby in not being fluent in French, and so I'm going to work on that a little bit.
Shabby?
Shabby.
Oh, goodness. That's a serious adjective
I think one of the definitions of an ugly American is monophone, is you got your own language and everyone else tough.
Well, I'd like to answer some email if you would allow it. We have some interesting ones. We'll start with an admonishment.
Oh, boy.
Well, no,
What is it?
it's my fault.
Oh, it was the grammatical attack.
Hugh Bryant.
I saw that.
In the intro to today's show, right before the news, the phrase "to he" was used. My mother rolled over in her grave. Quote,
I wrote
to
back and
him.
said, it warn't me.
Yeah.
It warn't me.
Well, I'm still unsure about that. I looked it up.
No, it's to him.
If it's to them, it's to him.
No. No.
Or if it's to they, it's to him.
No. It's always to him. So the preposition throws you into the
To he,
objective
I
case.
said to he and his compatriots.
No, to him. To means
Then I
acted
stand
at.
corrected.
So, yes, and
I wrote him right back and
I did
apologized.
too, and he was very gracious about
Yeah.
it, and his mother didn't roll over in her grave. But I made a mistake. Well, we all make the mistakes all the time, but I made one in a newspaper column a few years ago on lie, lay, laid, and someone pointed out to me, and I just wanted to hang myself because I pride myself in being grammatical. And when I fail at it, when I make a rookie classical mistake, it so bothers me. And then, of course, someone always points it out.
Oh, and they have continually. But my point in this is, and bringing it up, is that I appreciate that.
Of course, we need it.
Yeah, and
so, on facts more than on grammar.
Hugh, I hope
both.
you keep listening and continue to steer us in the right direction. We got a couple of very interesting pieces of mail that for future show ideas.
Okay.
I'm going to share them with you, get your reaction. But one came about a lost and found that if you, the Jefferson scholar, could go back and retrieve from history or from lost parts of history 5 things that were Jefferson's or affected him, what would they be? And you don't have to answer now, but I think that's a great idea.
It's a great show. I'll give you one that I just thought of. There was the Shadwell fire.
Yeah.
His boyhood home burned down, and with it, everything. All the paper, so there's this gap. Every Jefferson biographer has to figure out what to do about the gap because he's one of the writingest of all people. But all of the letters and so on that he wrote before he was in his 20s were lost in the Shadwell fire. And so there's one.
There's a couple more. We'll come back to that. After I didn't want to spring that on you. You hadn't seen that one yet. And then another one that was really interesting and we also should do a show on this, is Nathan Akers. He switched to the field to study medicine, but before that he studied music composition at the University of Minnesota. And he had thought in his mind that he would really like to write what he called a Jefferson opera.
An opera?
Right. But then he said about 6 months later, I heard a number of people raving about the musical Hamilton, and he felt beat to the punch. But he still may do this. He still may do this. And
the room is open.
He was asking. He says he has a set list out in his head of what to include, but wanted to know what you, quote, you all would recommend including. So let you think about
what
that.
The incidents that would appear in this opera.
Yeah, like
Mrs. Causeway singing an aria.
Yeah, something like that. So perhaps we'll
Ode
come
to
back
Hamilton.
Yeah. Then we got quite a bit of email. Now, I asked President Jefferson to react to this in a What Would Jefferson Do, the prelude to the show that is not included in the podcast, but you can find it at the Jefferson Hour site every week. It's called What Would Jefferson Do? A number of people, Dominic Hankel, Catherine Burdick, and a number of others wrote that Ivanka Trump had tweeted a quote from Jefferson. Did you follow this?
No.
Well, it's he wrote to Martha and said, surrounded by enemies and spies, catching and perverting every word that falls from my lips or glows from my pen, and inventing where facts fail them. was Thomas Jefferson's Reflections on Washington, D.C. in a letter to his daughter, Martha. And then she writes, "Some things never change, Dad."
No, I think she is right about this.
Well, there's a point to it for sure, yeah.
She's right about this. So whatever you think of Donald Trump, and I know we have a very wide range of views amongst our listeners, the vilification of Trump, the lack of any goodwill of any sort towards him, the deliberate misinterpretation of things that he says, the eagerness for him to fail, the glee that the left shows when he makes a gaffe or when he does something that's to their mind unacceptable. You can't go on this way. They did it to Obama. They did it to a certain degree to Bill Clinton. You can't have this. You can't have an utter lack of a willingness to be flexible and some sort of a fund of goodwill and tolerance. You can't go on as a republic if there is a kind of a hate machine. And I know that many people think he richly deserves it and blah, blah, blah.
But that's not the point,
But
though.
the
Right.
civility, the presidency deserves a respect that maybe an individual president doesn't necessarily earn. But the presidency itself deserves a level of respect. And I have to say, I'm shocked by the glee that I'm seeing on the left for the current difficulties of the president.
Well, not everyone on the left, but there are those.
A lot of it. And
Yeah.
if you turn on MSNBC, they're just in a thrill zone now. They think they've got him. You think, well, what do we gain by that? You know, when I was in Europe, I'll tell you this, it really bothered me. I was watching the BBC a little bit, and there are problems in Lebanon. There are problems in Syria. There are problems in South America. The world is taken to the streets, David. You don't see that in the United States. But if you watch the BBC or CNN International, you see what's going on in a very troubled world. Here we're so provincial, we're so inward-looking, and now we're fixated on this thing. And let me remind you of one of the last times we got fixated in this way. We were fixated on a congressional sex scandal during the summer of 2001. Chandra Levy and a congressman from California, and she'd been lost, and eventually it turns out she had been murdered, but not by the congressman. And this is all America could think about for about 2.5 months. And meanwhile, bin Laden was getting ready for the attacks on 9/11, and there was a commission led by Rudman and Gary Hart. And they had looked at this and they said, something's coming. You need to pay attention, America. Something's about to happen. And America did not pay attention. And when we were talking about a tawdry sex scandal that really just fizzled out, people who hate us were planning to bring down the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and maybe more. We have got to learn to put things in their place and not become obsessively, compulsively fixated on certain things. This is an important crisis. I don't think anyone listening to the Jefferson Hour thinks that I don't understand that. But there has to be some balance. There has to be a wider brush, a wider lens.
You said one side takes glee in, and I think both sides do.
Of course, but the extremism of that.
Yeah, it's just not productive.
It's boring.
Yeah, but it's addictive, too. It's like an endorphin adrenaline rush, these fights, right and wrong, and it's hard for people not to stay there.
We all feel it, but I think, do we really,
and it's exacerbated.
Are we happy about a constitutional impeachment crisis? How could you be?
Yeah.
The worst thing that can happen to a republic is this moment, because now we have to. Congress is not building an infrastructure. Congress is not helping solving the problem of our healthcare delivery system in the United States. Congress is not looking at our southern border or other porous borders in this country, or what is our immigration status for new Americans. What we're looking at is whatever the abuses are, whatever they're perceived to be, of this president, and Congress has no choice now but to fixate on this. The great work of a great society is not getting done. Mm-hmm. It's a tragedy. This is a tragedy. Even if you think that Donald Trump is the worst president in American history, this is a tragedy. If you think he's the best president in recent history, it's an even greater tragedy. But it's a tragedy for this country, and we have got to stop. We got to get this out of the way. We need to say, we'll do this on Tuesdays, but we're not doing it for the rest of the week.
That's good. I like that.
One day a week on this, you know.
Yeah, I wonder how you could implement that. That's
can't.
good. I like that.
You can't. It's a free society, but this is going to destroy us. Not just this, but these episodes where we get into a national feeding frenzy and a funk, as we're now in, you have to have a sense of balance. The great work of a great nation needs to be attended to. And while we're asleep at the wheel here, Argentina is moving forward, and China is moving forward, and India is moving forward, and other nations are doing what it takes, and we're doing nothing. And it's gonna bite us in a really huge way.
Well, I don't know if we're doing nothing. There's, that I go back to that book, The Fifth Risk, and you begin to understand the bureaucracy that people like to ride so hard. It continues, and it does great things for our nation.
I do think that the permanent bureaucratic culture, how we manage our national parks,
the weather,
things like that, OSHA, the meteorological work, those
Making
things
our
continue.
food safe.
There's been an attempt to politicize them, which I think is deplorable. But
I think it
basically,
started with Goldwater, really.
Our basic system is in place and is doing good work. We have to try to remember that, and we also have to remember that while we're fixating on the surface of this or other administrations, things in the second and third tier are happening below our radar, and they're where the action actually is in the future of this country.
I heard they brought up the idea of national parks, making them private institutions.
Right. Unbelievable.
That anybody would even talk about that.
And I talk about whose ox is gored. They're talking about eliminating the senior discount.
Oh,
I'll take to the streets over that. I'm about to be a senior.
Last week, Monmouth University released a poll, I think last Tuesday. The sample size was only 401, not very big. But according to this poll, 62% of people who approve of the job Donald Trump is doing as president say they can't think of anything he could do that would cause him to lose their support. Conversely, on the other side, 70% say there's nothing the president could do to gain their support. We all are so poll-driven. What's your take? Do we believe these? I mean, when I get a call from a pollster, I politely decline. I don't hang up. I say I choose not to participate.
I think we are, to use the cliche, baked in a very big way. I think that people who hate Trump, I know a few.
Who profits from that?
I think they hate Trump no matter what. If he did something even good, they would say, somebody did this for him.
But it's a fair question. You said we're baked in. I agree. Who's profiting from that?
I think that a couple of things are going on. One is social media. And so we live in echo chambers now. We watch Fox if we're Fox people. We watch MSNBC if we're the other. People go to where there's reinforcement for their outlook. And they tend not to move very far beyond that world of discourse. And they suspect the other one is not only being erroneous, fake news, but being un-American. And so the culture wars have turned into this really extraordinarily baked-in, polarized thing, and everyone's mutually suspicious. So there's that. But I do think there's still this huge center, the huge middle of the country of 100 million people that are basically reasonable and basically open to persuasion. We have to extend that farther out. And so if you go home and watch MSNBC or Fox, you'll come away depressed about this country. But I've been traveling around this country, and when you actually meet actual Americans, they're much more reasonable, open-minded, less doctrinaire than the...
Are you dancing around saying it's journalism that profits from this, or am I just making that up?
Well, I don't think it's just journalism, but I think it's true that when I was growing up, we had CBS, NBC, and ABC. And then came public television and public radio. And now we have, this is recent, we have ideological programming. So MSNBC is steadily left, but they have some people who are less left. And Fox is far right, in my opinion, but they have some people who are less right. And those are the people that bring credibility to both of these networks.
And there was a time when
that can't be good.
Foreign correspondents, journalists walked on water. I'm about halfway through a book you recommended to me. Thank you very much for this one, Citizens of London.
Oh, that's a great book about the World War II.
Right, and you learn about what was going on with with journalism and with government officials during that time. Murrow, Severide, people you listen to, and there was no question that they were telling us the truth.
But they earned the
They
truth.
invented it.
They earned it by
position.
being discreet.
Uh-huh.
They earned it by being non-doctrinaire. They earned it by admitting doubt. They earned it by realizing that they did not have the right to speak for America, and that their views weren't necessarily shared by the entire country. They were largely centrist. They were slightly left of center, I would say, for most of them, but they were largely centrist, and they still believed that journalism was a holy and sacred thing, that you had to try to get it right, that you listened. You questioned, but you listened. You didn't prejudge. You didn't. So MSNBC now only has people who hate Trump on. CNN at least tries a little bit to have some balance.
You know what we ought to do is start a movement to get people to just watch PBS NewsHour.
Or NPR. NPR radio news is, in all things considered, in Morning Edition, in my opinion, are the best things in America.
Agreed. BBC's not bad either.
We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.